Hi there, Loriano. As promised, this is my take on Buddhist thinking relating to perception into your video. It's not even close to a definitive word on the Buddhist philosophy of perception. I doubt there is one. It's an enormous topic, millions of words have been written over the last 25 centuries. There's more of a digestion of my readings and practice than a regurgitation of others' ideas. In Buddhist thought, the analysis of perception is centre stage in unravelling the causes of the central illusion that makes human life existentially unsatisfactory. It's in deconstructing perception minutely that Gautama shows where our positive and negative reactions to our perceptions enter, and that these reactions, be they craving, neutral or loathing, arise mentally, and how they can be removed, resulting in more faithfully perceived embodied life, rather than one distorted by reaction. Generally speaking, Buddhist thought is remedial, addressing the urgent problem rather than ontological, and its supposed ontologies are actually epistemologies, and progressive at that, making no sense until you've worked your way to them. In these modern times, we get, and through mass media, we get access to advanced teachings that would never have been given unless we had shown our teachers that we were at a level where we could absorb them without confusion. That being said, Buddhist teachers over the ages and cultures have elaborated on Gautama's initial teachings, which isolated our problem in the way our mind, through the dichotomizing effect of language, posits a temporal self separate from existence. For example, consider this simple situation. Language constrains me to express my existence as I am, but this has two particles, self and being. But if I look carefully, I don't experience my being as separate from me. It only arises in language. Same with all the other references to myself in language, spoken or thought. I, used as a subject, is different from I, the I that I experience. With the evolution of our reflexive consciousness, the habit of narrating ourselves is the default. In short, we live in our heads, a narration to what happens, rather than living what happens. In these narrations, everything is perceived and is categorized as good, I crave, or bad, I reject, or I guess, I don't mind. Both or all of these are discontentment if they're not downright suffering. The solution, the way to existential contentment, is to reprogram this innate, evolved habit of consciousness by learning to identify with more embodied and less narrated self. Some of the Buddhist formulaic or metaphorical thinking is deceptive and seems nihilistic, but it isn't if properly understood. For example, the idea of full enlightenment, nirvana or snuffing out, is an asymptote that is approached but rarely fully or permanently attained. But everyone glimpses it unconsciously, for example, when I fall out of time, when I'm in the grip of something which is totally involving. We are lost in the timeless moment. Many more approach it consciously and sometimes even deliberately by learning how to reprogram. That is, to move the identification from the narrated to the embodied self. Then what gets snuffed out is that narrated egotistical self. In this context, the idea of no self is better rendered as no narrated or no conventional self. In the orthodox formulation, it's called emptiness of self. The idea of a realized person as an embodied one in union with the world as it is, not identifying with the self the mind narrates in order to get by. The self acting, being, including thinking, as a subjective being, not as the object observed, acting, being or thinking. But doesn't this mean that we become a self without narration or thought and simply animal-like mindless action? No, this is where the Buddhist analysis removes the mind-body duality. Essentially, it's a collapse of the 5 outwardly directed bodily senses through which we gain access to the physical world, with the mind, the one inwardly directed sense with which we know the contents generated in the mind, such as thoughts or dreams, as well as those generated by the 5 outward senses. Its validity is obvious. The only world that we have is the one the brain makes of the relationship between all the sense objects and the sense organs. These 6 stores of consciousness, as they're called, are metaphors for how we experience the world, which is attributed as conventional reality. They unite 6 commingling strands of consciousness, 5 body and 1 mind. To spell it out a little more, since the earliest accounts, these 6 were described as the sense object, say sound, the sense organ, ear, and then the sense consciousness of sound. This consciousness sets off a vedana, a feeling in the brain to which we react either with craving, aversion, or neutrality. It's the same for taste, touch, smell, and sight. For mind, it's the relationship between the contents of mind and the brain that allows consciousness of mind's contents, which, as well as the other 5 consciousnesses, includes memories, thoughts, ideas, emotions, perception. Structurally, these 6 centers act the same way in the process of perception, and the mind versus body is a false dichotomy of language rather than an ontology. These 6 sense spaces form part of the radical deconstruction of the self, which is typical of Buddhism, called anatta. And over 25 centuries, many schools have employed different metaphors, ostensibly grounded in the insights gleaned in meditative practice rather than metaphysical analysis. And these naturally give somewhat different nuances or details as they attempt to capture the narrative representations of these experiences outside language. From the Buddhist point of view, I think by recognizing the union of body and mind consciousness with the objects of consciousness moves the balance into the embodied world and de-emphasizes the mind with respect to the body. This redresses the default imbalance of narrated over embodied self. It's not an either-or though, it's a both-and. The difference is one of identification. It helps us notice and identify with our embodied experience rather than deferring to the tyranny of the narration of that experience, which is the source of dukkha, life's discontentment, and the illusory sense of self and of temporality. With this change in perspective, like the magic eye pictures, nothing changes, yet everything changes. We still only experience the mediated world, but in a balanced way, with relative freedom from the illusions of thought. We see things as they are, or at least as close to it as possible. You talk about the reduction to vision being almost a reduction of vision because it reduces the contribution of other perception. I think the same could be said even more forcefully of mind, dominating as it does. The reduction of our lives to thought is a reduction of thought. We starve thought of the embodied dimension, at least consciously. Regarding the neutrality of the inputs or channels of the physical senses, they are not so neutral in that they are mediated by and reacting with each other through the mind consciousness, the 6th door, which unfortunately does but need not dominate. The McLuhan idea you mention of the balance changing in the sensorium, resulting in the new sensibilities, chimes in really well with the Buddhist rebalancing through toning down the mind consciousness, which they would want to say is by far the greatest imbalance and may account for what he calls the time-space bias. It is included in the sensorium rather than being distinct from it, making this all the more possible. The cool medium idea does gel well that you mentioned in your video. Detached in the Western way implies a standing off, not involved or committed, whereas the Eastern idea of it engages without the narrative commentary. In the now, to use that overused cliche, detached not from the action but from the narrative on the action. This brings you back in mind of Heidegger's absorbed pre-reflective action, and it brings me back in mind of action in mindfulness that meditation is trying to foster.